Hello learners. Today we are going to discuss about the constructors, types of constructors. We have three types of constructors: default constructor, parameterized constructor, copy constructor, and we also discuss about destructor. So one by one we are going to study about the constructors and destructors. One more thing, to check the object oriented programming concept and about the class and object concept, watch the last lecture 1, the class constructor. A class constructor is a special member function. The first thing is why we call it a special member function, because constructor is a special member function because constructor name will be same as a class name. Number 2, constructor is very useful to initialize the data members of the class. Number 3, constructor should be automatically called by the compiler, should be automatically invoked by the compiler whenever programmer creates an object for a class. So these are the things which making constructor special. Constructor should be writing inside the public section in the class. Constructor never be private. Constructor should be public all the time. So we can see here a class constructor is a special member function of a class that is executed whenever programmer create new objects of that class. Number 2, a constructor will have exact same name as the class and it does not have any return type at all, not even void. Constructor can be very useful for setting initial values for certain member variables. The compiler calls the constructor whenever an object is created. Constructor initialize values to the object members after storage is allocated to the object. So we understand here constructor is very helpful to initialize the data members of the class, or you can say to initialize the object of the class, because object hold all the members of the class. That's why we can say object initialization. Initialization means to put the value to the data members. To have a value for the data members is called initialization. So we can understand here constructor should be same as the class name. Constructor has no return type. Constructor should be public. Constructor is very useful to initialize the data members of the class, or you can say initialize the object of the class. And constructor should be called by the compiler automatically whenever an object is created for the class. So these are the important things which are making constructor special function. Constructor can be defined either inside the class definition or outside the class definition. We can write a constructor definition inside the class, or we can write a constructor definition outside the class. What we need for it? For it, we need a class name and scope resolution operator. The two columns together is called scope resolution operator. So you should remember while you are writing a source code in C++, we are using scope resolution operator to define the members outside the class. This member may be constructor, may be function, or maybe any data member. Whenever we are going to define outside the class, we use scope resolution operator with the class name. So we will check the two examples here. Both examples doing the same job, but the definition of the constructor, one is inside the class, another one is outside the class. So here we can check the first class A. Inside the class A we have a public section. In this public section we have two things. Number 1, data member of the class, the int type variable X. Number 2, constructor definition. A is a constructor because A is the same name of the class and is having a following parenthesis, and these parenthesis defines this is a member function. So if the member function is same as the class name, so it is a constructor. So in this constructor we are using two object initialization. We can see here we are seeing the object initialization. This is we are defining inside the constructor definition, and then we close the class. So two things we have here in the public section: integer type variable X and the constructor definition. It is inside the class A. After that we understand how can we write a constructor definition inside the class. Now we come to the next constructor definition outside the class A. Here the class A, the same inside the class definition, we have public section. In this public section, one integer type variable I and constructor declaration. This is called constructor declaration because we didn't give the parenthesis to be defining the constructor definition. So this is what? This is constructor declaration. After that, we will see the constructor definition. How can we write the definition for the constructor? A is a class name, scope resolution operator, and the constructor definition. So the constructor definition is I initialized by 1. We have given the value 1 to the data member I. I is a data member of the class A. So we can see here the class completes here, but we are putting the definition of the constructor A outside the class. So we are seeing here, we are taking a class name, scope resolution operator, and the constructor, and after that the definition we have given outside the class. So this is the way to define the constructor outside the class with the help of class name and the scope resolution operator. Now come to the next slide. Special characteristics of a constructor. So we can understand here, already we discussed in the last slides, constructor should be declared in the public section. The first thing is important. So you should know about the constructor should be public. Second is constructor will not have any return type, not even void. So constructor should be always a class type. So no return type for it. Now constructor gets automatically invoked when the objects are created. Constructor should be automatically called by the compiler whenever the objects are created for the class. Constructor cannot be inherited through derived classes. Constructor, always we remember this point, it is we are talking about the inheritance concept, so we will discuss in the inheritance section as well, but constructor cannot be inherited through the derived classes. Programmer can call the base class constructor. Programmer has a right to call the base class constructor, but it will not be inherited by itself. It's a parent-child relationship, so we will discuss after. Like other functions, constructor can have default arguments. So same whatever we know about the functions, in the functions we have a default function, parameterized function. So constructor also have a default constructor. Programmer cannot refer to their address. Programmer never know about the address of the constructor. It will be automatically logically defined by the system. Constructor cannot be virtual. Constructor never be virtual. It is a concept of dynamic binding or polymorphism to minimize the duplicacy of the source code. So constructor never be virtual. We should remember this point. Now types of constructor, we have three types of constructor. Number 1, default constructor. Number 2, parameterized constructor. Number 3, copy constructor. So default constructor is a constructor which does not have any argument, which does not take any parameters. So these are called default constructors. We can see here it has no parameter, but a programmer can write some initialization statement there. Programmer has a right to define the data members of the class, whatever you have a parameter for this or not. If you want to pass the values from outside the class, you should take the parameters. If you are having some values to be initialized inside the class, you can use default constructor in this regard. So now what is the syntax for the constructor? This is the syntax for the general syntax of the constructor. We cannot say this is a default constructor because default constructor having a 0 parameter, and here we have taken parameter 1, parameter 2, means it's a general syntax of the constructor. So general syntax, first is class name, then parameter 1, parameter 2 is a list of parameters and close the parenthesis. After that the definition part, we took here the constructor definition. Now in this example 1 we can understand default constructor. First is class, the class name is calc. In this calc class we have a data member. This data member we are not assigning any access specifier before this data member, so this data member by default private. So don't be confused in this regard. Data member by default private. Now the public section. Inside the public section we have a constructor for this class. In this constructor we initialize the value to the data member. So we have taken here the value for the val is 20. After that close the definition of the constructor and close the class. Now we want to execute the source code of calc class. How can we execute? Without creating object we are not able to execute the source code of this class. So how can we make a object for this? Firstly we need a main body. So we are creating a main function. This main function is an entry point of our program. So without main we are not able to execute a single statement in our program. So inside the main we will create an object for this class. So what is the class name? Calc. and C1 is the object name. This is a user defined data type we already discussed in the class and object section. So if you want to learn this particular class and object concept, you should watch the lecture number 1. So here we will see cout c1.val. So c1.val is the object of the class and val is the data member of the class calc. We can access only if it is public, but it is what? It is private. So because of this reason, we cannot access here the private members directly from the class outside the class, because we are outside the class. The main body is outside the class. Inside this main body, we are not allowed to access the private data members of the calc class. So that's why whenever we execute this program, we receive an error. This error because we are not allowed to use the private member to be accessed outside the class. So here, to minimize this error, what we have done, we have taken the class here, we have taken another class name, but the concept is exactly same. The class name is cube. The public section inside it is public because we have taken inside the public access specifier, and the constructor we have given the value to the side data member 10, and after that we close the class. Now int main, inside the main body we create the object of the cube class and cout c.side. So here this data member we can access. Why? Because it is the public data members we can access outside the class. So it is allowed to access. So that's why we receive the output. What is the value we initialize to the side variable? We initialize the value 10 here. So that's why we receive the value 10 as an output here. Continue. In this case, the object is created, the constructor is called, which initializes its data members. A default constructor is so important for initialization of object members that even if programmer do not define a constructor explicitly, the compiler will provide the default constructor implicitly. So here we can understand, if first we should learn about if the programmer is not defining any constructor for the class explicitly, means manually. If programmer is not defining any constructor for the class, compiler will provide default constructor automatically. Implicitly means automatically. So the compiler will provide the default constructor automatically. So we can see in this example default value by calling the constructor default constructor. So here the class cube, inside the class we have public section, inside the public section we have data member side. This data member is of integer type. You can see here we didn't write any constructor definition. We just have written the public data member and we have closed the class. Just this is the class definition. We didn't write any constructor definition inside the class. Int main. Inside the main body, we created an object for the cube class. After that, cout. In this cout object is used to display the output on the screen. Cout c.side. C is the object name. Side is a data member name of the class cube. So you can see here we didn't initialize any value to this data member. We didn't give any value to this data member. We didn't write any value to this data member. Whenever we execute this program, we get the output 0 or any random value. The value will be present from the system. So it is called random value. Okay, it never meaning, but the value should be of integer type. So this is what this is. This means we are not using to initialize the value constructor, but by default your system plays a role at the background, and constructor should be defined by the compiler implicitly, automatically. So in this example, default constructor is called by the compiler to initialize the object data member to default value. So automatically the default constructor is called by the compiler. You should remember this point. Whatever the programmer is writing a source code for the constructor or not writing the source code for the constructor, in case if you are not writing the source code of the constructor, your compiler definitely call the default constructor and the random value should be put to the data member of the class. This default value will be 0 or any random integer value. So this is the output if you are not providing a definition of the constructor in your program. Now parameterized constructor in C++. These are the constructor with parameter. Using this constructor, programmer can provide different values to data members of different objects by passing the appropriate values as an argument. So here we can understand parameterized constructor are the constructor where programmer passing arguments, where programmer passing parameters. It's clear. Now by using parameterized constructor, programmer have initialized three objects with user defined values. It is with you can see in the example we have given here three objects to be initialized with the help of the parameterized constructor. So now we can see here, and there is no limitation of the parameters to the constructor. You can have number of parameters as per your choice. So programmer can have any number of parameters in a constructor. There is no limitation about how many parameters you are able to pass in the constructor. So there is no guidelines about to be limit. So unlimited parameters you can pass as per your choice. So parameterized constructor, first is a class, the cube, then the public section, integer, side, then cube. We pass a single parameter of integer type x, then we initialize this data member side by the value x, whatever we pass to this constructor. Okay, this constructor value should be used to initialize the data member of the class. So we have given this x to the data member of the class. Close the constructor, close the class. Now come to the main body. Inside the main body we created three objects, cube, c1, c2, c3. c3, these are the three objects of the class and we pass the different value to each object. The c1 we pass like 10, c2 we pass 20, c3 we pass 30. So we have initialized three objects with the data member of the cube class. So you can see here the data member of the cube class inside it consumes 4 bytes of memory. Whenever we create three objects, how much memory should be consumed by it? So it consumes 4 bytes for C1, 4 bytes for C2, 4 bytes for C3. So 12 bytes of memory will be consumed by the side data member C1.side, C2.side and C3.side. Automatically it will be done by the compiler. You don't bother about to write the statement like this in your program because you are using constructor. Constructor should be automatically calling by the compiler. So that's why the value should be initialized by the constructor automatically whenever the object create for the class to your data members. Now cout cout is an object to display the value to the screen. So that's why cout c1.side, it will display the first value. Whatever we initialize it, we initialize here the 10 because whenever you create an object, it will directly call the constructor. The constructor is cube. So it will initialize this value to the variable x, and this x variable initialize the value to the side variable. So side will get the value from the x. Like the same for 20, like the same for 30. So we will have a values like this. C1, C2, C3 will have a values differently, and it will call 3 times the constructor of the cube class, because first calling for C1, second calling for C2, third calling for C3. So it will initialize the different values for C1, C2, C3, and it will display the output accordingly. C1 dot side is 10, C2 dot side is 20, C3 dot side is 30. So we receive the value as an output 10, 20, 30 as per the value initialized by the constructor cube by the object C1, C2 and C3. Come to the copy constructor. Copy constructor is a wonderful concept. Why? Because copy constructor is used to create a copy of an already existing object of the class type. What is the meaning about? The meaning is very important, because if you are looking for to take one value of the variable to another value of another variable, so if you are taking a value from one variable and putting to another variable, then means we are talking about like 3 variables values, and you want to put to another 3 variables. So means you need to write each initialization for 3 variables. If you have 100 variables, so you need to write this initialization statement for 100 times. The programmer should not be bothered about. The copy constructor is a solution for this problem. How can we do this? We just take one object, and all the values from this object we will initialize to another object. So but you should have one object in which you have already the values, so the existing object only have a values to copy to the another object. So in this case we will use the copy constructor. So we will read the definition here. Copy constructor is a type of constructor which is used to create a copy of an already existing object of a class type. It is usually of the form X. The first X is a constructor, same as the class name. Second X is a user defined data type. It is using for to declare a type of the reference object. This second X is used to declare a type of the reference object. We will understand in the source code. And ampersand is used for reference of the object. Now, where X is a class name, the compiler provides a default copy constructor to all the classes. Compiler will have always a default copy constructor to all the classes. Whatever you are writing a source code for the copy constructor or not, your compiler provides a default copy to all the classes. So now syntax of the copy constructor: number 1, class name. Number, in the class name we have a parameter. There's a constructor, so we have a parameter here. The parameter first is a const keyword. Const keyword is always used to fix the values. Second, the class name. This class name is a user defined data type to make sure the type of the object reference. So this ampersand is using to give the reference of this object. Okay, this is an existing object. This object is already we have created for a class, and now we are going to create a new object, but this object values we are going to assign the new object. So here this is very helpful by the copy constructor. So here we can see in the graphical form, this is a copy constructor. It is a new object. Copy of the object created is a new object, and this object from the outside. Okay, So this object is an existing object, this object is a new object. Existing object is this. Okay. Now it is point to be remember, when we create an object we need constructor. When we create object we should have constructor. Okay, constructor will be automatically called by the compiler whenever programmer creates an object for the class. We know very well, we studied it. And when we are copying the values of existing object and make a new object, we need copy constructor. So here we have written the same, as it is used to create an object, hence it is called a constructor, and it creates a new object which is an exact copy of the existing copy, hence it is called copy constructor. When we just create an exact copy of the new object, we use a copy constructor. Now we see the program. In this program we can see hash include iostream is a header file, using namespace std is a namespace, root namespace. The class name is sample copy constructor. In this class we have private members, int x, y, these are the data members. Public sample copy constructor, int x1, int y1. In this constructor we can see x1 and y1 are the values. This is a constructor, is a simple constructor, and these are the values we are initializing to the data members x and y. Now we see the copy constructor. In this copy constructor, first is class name, second the const keyword, third is a user defined data types, the again class name, and we take a reference of the object. We take a reference of the object. This object is an existing object. So now we are taking a value from this object sem.x and initialize through the data member of the class sem.y and initialize to the data member of the class y. So here means we are taking the last values of x, whatever we initialize in this constructor, and putting to the new object. So object initialization with the help of object. Object should be initialized with the help of object. So we have here two data members, so two statements we have written. If we have three data members, three statements we will write. So like that, and we close it. After that, void display cout x and space then y. So this is only the way of showing the output on the screen. So void display is a method to show the output on the screen here, because we are writing here cout statement. So now close the class. So what we have in this class, the private members, two private members x and y, these are data members. Then the public, in the public section we have one constructor and one copy constructor and one display method or function. Then close the class. So we can see here the main body. Inside the main body, int main is the main function and is a normal constructor. Sample copy constructor object 1, here 10 and 15. So we pass the values here for x1 and y1 because this is a constructor and it's a class name and the object name 1. Whenever we create object, the value should be initialized to the data members of the class. So that's why these values directly connect with x1 and y1, and we receive the value to be initialized to the variable x and variable y. So 10 and 15. So x1 will be 10 and y1 will be 15 in this case, and x and y will have the value 10 and 15 now. Copy constructor. Sample copy constructor object 2. We create a second object, but we should have a first object to initialize the value, then only we are going to access the copy constructor. So here the object 1 is already existing, So we are giving this object 1 all the values to the object 2 in one shot. So whenever we access this part, it will directly connect to the copy constructor, and here this is the reference of the object 1. This is the reference of the object 1, and all the data members should be initialized as per the values we have already in the object 1. So these are the values we have getting from the last, and we are initializing to the data members of the class, and these values should be stored for the new object. So now after that we just use cout. It's a normal constructor. It is only for to showing the result from which constructor we are receiving. Just because of this reason we have taken cout normal constructor. We have written here to understand the particular part of the program only. So obj1.display. So object 1 values are 10 and 15, and display is the method. So it will directly connect to the display method. The values whatever we have already stored here, 10 for x and y 15. So these values coming from here directly to the display method, and it will be execute and it will show the result. Cout normal constructor 10 and 15. Okay, so 10 for x, then space, and 15, then next line endl. Now come to the copy constructor. Cout copy constructor. First it will print the copy constructor, then object2 dot display. Now object 2 is a new object. So in this object we will check again. Automatically we will receive the value x and y, the same values. What is the meaning about? Means with the help of copy constructor we have copied the object 1 value to the object 2. So this is copy constructor result. Now return 0. It will return the value to the operating system and then close the main body. Destructors. Constructor is used to create an object, and destructor is used to destroy the class object. So destructor is used to destroy the class object, to remove the object. So destructor is a special class function which destroys the object as soon as the scope of object ends. Whenever the scope of the object will be over, then the destructor will release the memory and allocate the memory for next variables, so next objects. So it will destroy the objects and release the memory. It will make a performance high for the system, and the memory management will be done in this regard. The destructor is called automatically by the compiler when the object goes out of scope. Whenever the object is going out of scope, destructor will be called automatically by the compiler. The syntax for the destructor is same as of the constructor. The class name is used for the name of the destructor with the tilde sign. This symbol is like a snake. This symbol is a tilde sign. So you should remember this symbol while you are using a destructor. It is very important, and we use as a prefix of the constructor. So here is a class A. Inside the class A, in the public section, defining destructor for a class, we use a constructor with the tilde operator. Whenever we are using a prefix tilde operator for a constructor, it will become a destructor. So now it is a destructor, and we pass a statement here, destructor definition, and we close the class. Destructor should be public as the constructor is public, and destructor will not have any argument. Whatever you have a argument for the constructor, but it is not a meaning that you should have argument for the destructor. Destructor will not have any argument. You will not use any argument to the destructor. So we have note here also, destructor will never have any arguments. So this is a destructor to destroy the objects, the constructor to create the objects. How constructor and destructor are called in C++ program? Here programmer have a simple class A with the constructor and the destructor. Programmer will create object of the class and see when a constructor is called and when a destructor gets called. So here is a class A constructor. For the class A is a, we know that how to write the definition of the constructor. So after that constructor called we have written here. Now the destructor, the constructor with the tilde operation, so it is called destructor. See how destructor called. Just we have written two definitions, one for constructor, one for destructor, and close the class. Now we create an object of the class. How can we create? Again we create a main body. Inside the main body for class A object 1 constructor called int x, means we have given some value to the variable x. If x means it is always true because the values become 1. Just make a block of the if a object 2 constructor called. Now you can see here object 2, when you create an object 2 destructor called for object 2. First you created the object 1, so constructor called. In the section of the if block you are creating object 2, again constructor called, because you are creating object. Whenever you create an object your constructor will be called automatically by the compiler. We already studied about. Whenever you have a closing of if block, object 2 scope will be over. So object 2 scope will be over means destructor call. Which destructor call? Destructor called for the object 2. Here destructor called for the object 2. Why? Because object 2 scope is over. Because object 2 scope is over. Object 2 is out of scope now. So that's why destructor called for object 2. Whenever you close the main body, whenever you complete the main function, destructor 4 called for object 1. Why? Because now inside the main body object 1 will be over. Inside the if block object 2 was over. So here destructor called for object 1. So you should remember this point, which object will be over when it will be finish its scope. Constructor called because we have used here the statement cout. Okay, whenever the object 1 is creating, then it will call the constructor. Whenever object 2 created, it will again call the constructor. Whenever object 2 scope over, then the destructor will be called. Whenever object 1 scope will over, again the destructor called. So here the destructor called. So we should remember the object scope should be over, destructor should be called in this regard. When an object is created, the constructor of that class is called. The object reference is destroyed when its scope ends, which is generally after the closing curly bracket for the code block in which it is created. So we can see here the object 2 is destroyed when the if block ends. We have already studied in the last program, because it was created inside the if block, and the object 1 is destroyed when the main function ends. So these things we already understand. Now single definition for both default and parameterized constructor. How can we take a single definition for default and parameterized constructor? In this example, programmer will use default argument to have a single definition for both default and parameterized constructor. Here in this program, a single constructor definition will take for both these object initializations. Programmer does not need for separate default and parameterized constructors. So we can see here we will take only the one definition for both default and parameterized. How can we write this? Class dual. In this class we have a public section. Here we are writing a data member of integer type a, and the constructor dual int x initialized by the value 0. A is a data member initialized by the value x. So you can see here we have given one value fix 0. So in this regard, if you are passing a value from the object outside the class, the value of the x will be changed because x is a variable. The value of x will be changed and the changed value will be assigned to the a variable of the class. But if you are not using any value from outside the class, it means you are using a default constructor. The default value is 0 for this class, so this 0 value will be directly assigned to the variable a. So that's why we can say we are using a default constructor as well as parameterized constructor. Now we can see from the main body. Inside the main body, we create object 1. We did not pass any value to the object 1, and definitely it will call the constructor, because whenever we create an object, it will call the constructor automatically. Whenever it calls the constructor, so constructor is dual. What is the default value here? Default value we initialize 0. So that's why the value for the a variable becomes 0 in this regard. Second is dual object 2. We have created object 2, but we pass the value 10 here. So whenever we pass the value here, it will directly go again to the constructor and it will change the value from 0 to 10 because the 10 we passed here. So it changed the value 10 here. So it will work as a parameterized constructor. So now this value 10 will be initialized here and it will be initialized to the data member of the class A. So we can understand here, one time we use default constructor, one time we use parameterized constructor. Thank you. Thank you so much, and subscribe my channel, like, share and comments on my channel.